On behalf of my colleague, Dr. Bob Weber from Kansas State University, and I'd like to welcome you to the module entitled Genomic-Enabled Genetic Evaluations. I'm Matt Spangler, and I'll be the presenter for this module. I'm a professor of animal genetics and extension beef genetics specialist at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. I hold a PhD in animal breeding and genetics from the University of Georgia, and I have been able to work with the genetic evaluation of over 20 different beef cattle breed organizations. As a general overview of this module, we'll discuss relationships among animals, and more specifically, how those relationships are quantified using pedigree and genomic information. We'll also talk about hybrid models that combine information from pedigree, phenotypes, and genomics. We'll discuss the impact that genomic information has on the accuracy of EPD and quantify this using progeny equivalence and compare it to other sources of information. And finally, we'll discuss the influence that genomic information has on the rate of genetic gain. If we take a historical look at selection, it began arguably around the time of domestication, where selection would have been on phenotypes, presumably those that made it easiest to domesticate particular animals. If we fast forward a considerable amount of time, we began using statistical predictions, really 4 to 5 decades ago. And these predictions are what we now think of as EPD, or expected progeny differences, and corresponding economic selection indices. These predictions utilize pedigree information as well as phenotypes. Much more recently, within the past decade, we began using DNA markers in the form of single nucleotide polymorphisms in the same general framework that we use to calculate EPDs. But now we've been able to seamlessly merge together the wealth of genomic information along with our traditional pedigree and phenotypic information to create what we call genomically enabled or genomically enhanced EPD. Here I have a description of the general approaches used to incorporate genomic information into EPD over the past decade. The first is what I call external, whereby external to the genetic evaluation itself, marker effects are estimated, and for newly genotyped animals, those marker effects are used to calculate what we call a molecular breeding value. The molecular breeding value is then incorporated into the calculation of EPDs either through a correlated trait approach in the genetic evaluation or post-evaluation by indexing together the molecular breeding value and the EPD. That's a process we've called blending. However, in the US, all major beef breeds have moved to one of two what I call internal processes, whereby genomic information along with pedigree and phenotypes are used simultaneously in the genetic evaluation. The first of those methods makes use of genomic relationships, and that process is generally what we call single-step genomic best linear unbiased prediction, or single-step GBLUP. The second actually estimates the effects of markers for a selected subset of markers and also calculates a traditional EPD. Those two are done simultaneously in the same genetic evaluation, and we call this hybrid marker effects models. First, let's talk about relationships more generally. Pedigree information has been the primary method to incorporate relationships into genetic predictions, and it is still very much the backbone. The benefit of pedigree is it's usually deep, or in other words, it goes back many, many generations. but as we have come to realize, it has been prone to errors, and across different species and breeds, that error rate can be around 10% or greater. These errors occur because mistakes happen in production. They could be mistakes in artificial insemination, whereby a cow is simply bred to the incorrect bull. There could also be mistakes made when there is artificial insemination followed by the use of natural service sires, and the use of average gestation length is used to determine whether a calf is the product of AI or natural service. Given that not every animal gestates for the same number of days, this can create the uncertainty and, as a consequence, the incorrect call as to who the correct sire is. Although sometimes overlooked, there's also the potential for mismatches to the dam. Oftentimes in close proximity or because there is a weather event that creates confusion and calves mistakenly get paired with the incorrect dam. Regardless of how the pedigree errors occur, they do create issues in terms of routine genetic evaluation. Genomic data now augments pedigree and enables deviations from expected degrees of relationship. And an added benefit is it has the opportunity to both identify and correct pedigree errors. This example shows a traditional pedigree. In this case, it's a 3-generation pedigree. On the right-hand side, you have what we would call the numerator relationship matrix, or relationships based off of the pedigree. These are expected relationships between individuals. Let's look at a couple of examples. The relationship between individual 7 and individual 10 reflects the relationship between an individual and its parent. And from the table on the right-hand side, you can see that that relationship is 0.5. Now let's look at the relationship between individual 1 and individual 10. This would be the relationship between an individual and a grandparent. And from the table, you can see that that is 0.25. If we look at the relationship between individuals 1 and 2, you'll see that that is 0. Individuals 1 through 6 are what we would consider as founders. It's the beginning of the pedigree, and we make the assumption that those individuals are unrelated, simply because that's where our pedigree stops. Using the same pedigree, let's now look at estimates of genomic relatedness. Now, let's focus on, again, individuals 1 and 10. Before, if you recall, the expected relationship based on pedigree alone between individuals 1 and 10 was 0.25. Now, if we look at the relationship between individuals 1 and 10 based on genomic information, that relationship is 0.2, slightly less. We know theoretically that the relationships between an individual and a grandparent can range from 0 to 0.5, with an average of 0.25, assuming no inbreeding. Let me explain why the relationships between, in our example, 1 and 10 could be 0 or could be 0.5. Individual 1 passes on a random half of their alleles to their offspring, in this case individual 7. Individual 7 then passes a random half of its alleles on to its offspring, individual 10. By chance, the alleles passed from individual 7 to individual 10 could have all come from individual 2, in which case the relationship between 1 and 10 is 0. The converse could also be true, where the alleles passed from individual 7 to individual 10 could have all come from individual 1, creating a relationship of a half between 1 and 10. The use of genomic kinship, such as this, for genotyped animals, coupled with pedigree relationships for non-genotyped animals in the same genetic evaluation, is done through a method called single-step genomic BLUP. In the US, the software most commonly used for genetic evaluations that use this methodology is developed at the University of Georgia. Here we have a slide depicting relationships in a real population between individuals and their grandparents using genomics. The vertical red bar denotes the average, approximately 0.25. But you'll see there's a normal distribution around that, ranging from approximately 0 to approximately 0.5. It is through the more accurate estimate of relationships between individuals, such as this, that enables more accurate EPD. Another method of in a single step combining genomic, phenotypic, and pedigree information is sometimes called a hybrid approach, whereby EPDs are calculated for genotyped animals, denoted here as the small g, and non-genotyped animals denoted as the small n. For the genotyped animals, their EPD comes about through a set of marker effects, denoted here as the alphas, plus the component of their EPD that comes about through knowledge of phenotypic information separately from genomics. So it's the combination of what we call an extra polygenic effect driven by phenotypes and marker effects, which are estimated from the data included in the genetic evaluation. The division of 2 simply puts it on the scale of an EPD instead of the scale of an estimated breeding value, or EBV. For the non-genotyped animals, we have the same EPE due to phenotypic information, but now we have this residual, the RPE, or sometimes called the residual polygenic effect. This is because in this type of approach, the markers are actually imputed to non-genotyped animals. So even the non-genotyped animals have a solution based on marker effects, but those markers are imputed from genotyped relatives. In either case, the important message is that genomic information is seamlessly integrated into the genetic evaluation in a single step, and interacts or is combined with information coming from phenotypes and pedigree to create a genomically enhanced EPD. In the software that is utilized for this type of approach, I would point out that the accuracy is not approximated, and as a consequence, the resulting accuracy associated with EPD is generally considered to be less biased, and as a consequence, you can think of it as being a more accurate value of accuracy. The model that I just mentioned, the hybrid model, is implemented using software called BOLT, Biometry Open Language Tools, and is offered by a company called Theta Solutions. Currently, it takes advantage of a few thousand markers that are identified a priori as being particularly influential at predicting particular traits. This approach is utilized in the US by the American Hereford Association and a group called International Genetic Solutions, which conducts the genetic evaluation in a multi-breed context for well over 15 different breed organizations from the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. The single-step GBLUP method that I mentioned that takes advantage of genomic kinship is done by software developed at the University of Georgia. The advent of these single-step genomic evaluations has also created the need for more frequent genetic evaluations. Historically, genetic evaluations in the U.S. were done twice a year. The reason being there are two primary calving seasons, spring and fall, and as a consequence, new data became available in general twice a year. However, now all major U.S. beef breeds conduct genetic evaluations on a weekly basis, and this is largely because there are new data, principally genomic data, that are becoming available all the time. This has also necessitated automation of genetic evaluations. I would point out that the correlations of EBV within a population between subsequent genetic evaluations or between weeks is generally very high. The only real changes occur on animals that have new phenotypes or have been recently genotyped. Let's look further into where the increase in accuracy of genomic EPD actually comes from. BV in this case is breeding value, or the genetic merit of an individual. Recall that an EPD, or expected progeny difference, is half of a breeding value. Progeny receive half of their genetic material from each parent. The breeding value of an individual is equal to half the breeding value of their sire, plus half the breeding value of their dam, plus a term related to Mendelian sampling, what is actually passed from one generation to the next. The benefit of genomic data is that it can, in part, account for the Mendelian sampling term, what was actually passed from one generation to the next. And it is partially accounting for this Mendelian sampling that gives rise to an increase in the accuracy of our estimates of EPD. Let's now compare the change in accuracy given different types of information. On the vertical axis, I have Beef Improvement Federation accuracy. And on the horizontal axis, I have different sources of information. Pedigree estimate, an individual's own performance record, genomic data, an individual's own performance record plus genomic data, records from a few progeny, and records from a large number of progeny. There are a few things to note. The highest accuracy values attained come when individuals have lots of progeny that have phenotypes recorded. However, genomic data, as compared to only a pedigree estimate, is dramatically different, whereby having genomic data dramatically increases the accuracy. And another important take-home message from this is that genomic data alone does not fully increase accuracy to the highest levels. It is genomic data coupled with phenotypic data where we see the greatest gains. Another way to look at the impact of accuracy of genomics is through what we call progeny equivalence. On the far left, I have various traits: calving ease direct, birth weight, weaning weight, yearling weight, maternal calving ease, milk, stayability, and marbling. Then across the top, I have different breed organizations. AAA is the American Angus Association, AHA is the American Hereford Association, and IGS is International Genetic Solutions, the large multi-breed genetic evaluation collaboration that I mentioned before. Let's look at an example. If we look at the trait of weaning weight for Angus, the value is 26. The interpretation is that by simply genotyping a non-parent animal, that genotype has the same effect on the animal's accuracy for weaning weight EPD as if that animal had become a parent and had 26 offspring with weaning weight recorded. That is a substantial gain in accuracy, particularly if we think about traits that are expressed much later in life, things that are maternal in nature or carcass traits, whereby it could take a great deal of time to accumulate offspring with the phenotype recorded. What are the benefits of increasing accuracy? For bull buyers or buyers of semen, it's a mitigation of risk. Having more accurate EPD helps ensure that the bulls you're choosing are actually excelling for the traits that you think they are. For seed stock producers, it allows faster genetic progress. This is the breeder's equation, which depicts the change in breeding value or genetic merit per unit of time. And that's related to the accuracy of EPD, which is the R, selection intensity, which is related to how superior the individuals selected are compared to the population average. We have sigma BV, which is the genetic standard deviation, and in the denominator L, which is the generation interval. Historically, generation interval and accuracy have been antagonistically related, such that increasing accuracy took time, which meant that by the time individuals had highly accurate EPD, they were also older. Through genomics, we can now increase accuracy on young animals, meaning we can begin to break this antagonism and make even faster rates of genetic change. I would point out that increased accuracy does not mean that EPDs necessarily always go up or always go down. Genotyping increases accuracy, meaning that an individual is equally as likely to have an EPD move up or to move down. In summary, genomic information is seamlessly integrated into the EPD across all major U.S. beef breed evaluations. There are differences in terms of the methods used to do this, but in all cases they are single-step methods, meaning that genomic information, available pedigree, and phenotypes are all used simultaneously in the genetic evaluation to create genomically enhanced or genomically enabled expected progeny differences. Through the inclusion of this genomic information, we now have EPDs that are more accurate than ever. It is critical to note, however, that genomic information by itself does not lead to continued increases in accuracy, and it is through the coupling of genomic information and continued recording of phenotypes where we see the largest gains. For continued learning, I would encourage you to watch the next module in this series, Module 10, focused on breeding system design principles. For concepts related to genomic-enabled genetic evaluations, I would encourage you to watch Module 2, related to EPDs, Module 3, related to genetic evaluation systems, Module 6, related to accuracy of EPD, and Module 7, focused on the basics of genomics. For more information on the USLGE, I would encourage you to visit their website listed here. And again, I'd like to thank you for watching this module.